Well, good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so very much for taking time to join us on our supply chain. How do we heal the healthcare value chain? During today's call, all lines are on mute and will remain on mute for the duration of today's session, but we're very interested in the questions that you do have. So we're going to have you place those in the lower right-hand corner of the screen where you see it says Q&A. During today's call, we're going to have 2 polling questions. You'll see those also appear on the right-hand side. Just go ahead and when the question comes up, read the question and simply fill in the answer and make sure you hit submit, and we'll share the results with you. Now, without further ado, it's my extreme privilege to turn the call over to Constance Carroll. Constance, the call is yours.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you for joining us on today's Supply Chain Insights webinar. Today's webinar will be presented by Lora Cecere, founder of Supply Chain Insights, and Karen Conway, Executive Director of Global Healthcare Exchange. We have the privilege of having guest panelist Roddy Martin, Managing Director of Healthcare and Consumer Products with Accenture, and Ken Thomas, President of Taith Group. Jeffrey helped us out with some housekeeping items, chatting questions. We would like to compile your questions, and we will get to them towards the end of today's program. And we also encourage you to complete the poll questions as well and participate. We also would love to continue this conversation on Twitter using the hashtag SCIWebinar. And we have a lot to get through today, and we recruited a great panel who will address important questions on this topic. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Lora Cecere.
Awesome. Thanks, Constance. And it's great to be joined by Karen, Ken, and Roddy. When I think about the healthcare value chain, I think about these 3 leaders. Karen has been very active with the work with GHX and hospitals and medical devices. Ken has a long history with Eli Lilly and now is doing some one-on-one consulting with pharmaceutical companies as they're facing the patent cliff. And I've had the great pleasure to work with Roddy Martin for the last 10 years, looking at pharmaceutical and the healthcare value chain and what do we do. So I recently wrote a book, Bricks Matter, and in that book I looked at all of the value chains and I looked at progress. And one of the things that I firmly believe is we don't have best practices, we have evolving practices. And at Supply Chain Insights, what we're trying to do is put together research so that supply chain leaders can drive the discussion forward about how do we move and really jumpstart these evolving practices. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to share insights on financial information on healthcare companies and use that as a backdrop for us to have a discussion around what do we do. So I think one of the problems is that we fought for a seat at the table for supply chains. And in the process, we created supply chains as a department, not as the ability to create end-to-end value networks. And Roddy's going to talk a lot about outside in, and I really believe that as we move towards value networks and we think about the healthcare supply chain more as a value network, we can't look at the supply chain as a department. We have to look at it as a way of doing business. And we have to embrace the evolution of moving from efficient to reliable to resilient to adopting some of the demand-driven practices, and then to build the horizontal process connectors and drive continuous learning to orchestrate the drive across the value chain. Now, a lot of people talk about collaboration, and one of the things we've learned as we think about value networks is we've got to have the right stuff. We've got to be able to look at shared vision, shared skills, the right incentives, the right resources, the right plan, and the right leadership so that we can drive change versus what we often see as confusion, anxiety, false starts, frustration, or gradual change. And this is actually one of my favorite slides as we talk about value networks. It's one that I've borrowed from Procter & Gamble, and Procter & Gamble will say that they spent many years being stuck because they did not have the right stuff. And I think as we focus on the evolution of the value chain in healthcare, we also have to say, do we have the right stuff? Are we aligned? And so to get ready for today, what we did was we looked at the healthcare value chain, and we looked at where are the members of the value network on what we call the effective frontier, which balances the metrics of growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity. And what we have done at Supply Chain Insights is we have written a series of reports called Supply Chain Metrics That Matter that look at where we are as industries and where we are on value networks against the balance of these ratios. It is our belief from the research that we have to manage this as a system, really looking at trade-offs, and that we have to be able to look at where we're at. Now, when we look at the healthcare value chain, we find that we're stuck. And in fact, in many ways, we're moving backwards, right? So if we look at 2000 to 2011, and we look at first operating margin, you know, the hospitals, you know, average an operating margin that's 1/3 that of medical device manufacturers. And as we see, it's much less than what we see for pharmaceutical manufacturers. But more importantly, if we look at the basis of what's happening, we have a shift in power to the hospitals, and we have operating margin growing for the hospital faster, and it's falling for the pharmaceutical companies. And likewise, what we see is the pharmaceutical manufacturers who have 3 times the level of inventory of similar peer groups of chemical or CPG are actually growing inventories. Likewise, medical device companies are growing inventories. But all are improving productivity, but we're not really able to drive value network success, really looking at outside in from the patient back, to be able to power these metrics across the value chain. So one of the things that we're looking at Supply Chain Insights is how do we create value networks, and how do we really drive collaboration or the right stuff across the effective frontier to be able to drive true value. So with that, let me ask the audience a question. If you're a manufacturer or you're a distributor or you're a hospital in this healthcare value chain, I'd like for you to answer this poll. What is the largest impact to your value chain today? Is it legislation? Is it talent? Is it the redefinition of relationships? Or is it leadership? And as the audience responds, what I'd like to do is ask the panel, Karen, Ken, and Roddy, their opinion. Roddy, let's start with you. What do you think the biggest challenge or largest impact is for the healthcare value chain to go forward?
So I think there's 2 issues. I think one is visibility, and it's directly related to trust. You have, so in contrast to many other supply chains, consumer electronics, consumer goods, industrial, where you have a, I won't say a well-integrated supply chain, but you have, in healthcare, you have different components of business that have a lack of visibility and therefore a lack of trust.
Okay, and so
the fact that you have a lack of visibility means that you can't accurately plan, you can't accurately forecast, and you can't accurately respond.
Karen, your thoughts? Let's move to Ken. Ken, what are your thoughts here?
Well, if I look at the categories that you've supplied here, you know, I think the barrier is this redefinition. It's much what Roddy referenced is the relationships, and your data shows it. The balances in this industry are shifting. The balance of power is shifting. And in fact, the nature of healthcare is shifting. The nature of illness is shifting. So what we're seeing over time is a shift from acute care to chronic care. We're shifting from much of the healthcare being provided within controlled environments, hospitals, and so forth, to outside. And that shifting of healthcare and the shifting of balance of power is leading the relationships. And so there's a massive reorganization taking place, and the massive rationalization at the patient end. And the barrier that, again, I look at this from kind of the front end, the barrier is understanding that marketplace rationalization and trying to keep up with the changes through the relationships.
So let's go back to Roddy. So Roddy, how do you think we redefine those relationships to be able to drive that higher level of, I guess, value?
So I think, Laura, the issue is that we haven't yet reached the stage of maturity in the life sciences supply chain where we're measuring patient outcome. So at the end of the day, if you look at the leaders in consumer electronics, is the product available when we've got a new product on the shelf? In consumer goods, we launch a product, is it available on the shelf? In the patient system, are we measuring patient outcome, and are we translating the responsiveness of the network to patient outcome? And I think that when we do that, and when that's visible, we will start driving the end-to-end supply chain as an end-to-end capability.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. Yeah, I'm going to jump in. Absolutely wonderfully said. When, you know, your slide on Right Stuff talked about shared vision and incentive. And Roddy's speaking about a shared vision and incentive that unfortunately hasn't been clear to the participants in the value chain because they are incented differently. Manufacturers are incented in one way, distributors in another way, retailers in another way, providers in yet another way, patients in yet another way. And you would hope that in the long run, when we rationalize this thing about the incentive, the vision is patient outcome. And when we get clear on that at the marketplace, now we start to rationalize. We have a shared vision, we have the incentive, and we can begin to align the supply chain. Now, I see that happening in a few places. But broadly speaking, absolutely, we don't have the shared vision and incentives, and it's not really around patient health outcomes.
Well, I think Karen's back with us now. Karen?
I am. Don't you love technology? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. So we've been talking about how we get the right stuff and how we drive patient outcomes. What are your thoughts?
So I think one of the biggest issues, particularly from the healthcare provider, the delivery system perspective, is really having an understanding of the role that the supply chain can play in helping us meet the objectives of this changing healthcare landscape. So exactly what Roddy said about visibility and trust, and what Ken was talking about in terms of outcomes. Mostly hospitals have looked at supplies and the supply chain as how much am I buying and what price am I paying for it, and how can I get the absolute lowest price, as opposed to really understanding what is the role that that supply plays in lowering costs or driving total cost of ownership and better outcomes. Because a more expensive product, for example, might actually reduce hospital-acquired infections, reduce readmissions, and then also understanding that supply chain there are probably 7 to 9 supply chains in most hospitals and healthcare systems. They do med-surg, different than pharma, different than lab, different than radiology, different than linens, and they need to have this much larger understanding. But the drive towards what we need to do with healthcare reform and understand what truly drives value, lower cost, better quality, is making more organizations look at the supply chain as a strategic asset.
So Karen, 4-to-1, the audience response said redefining relationships. You know, who do you think's doing it well? Where can people look? And then I'm going to ask Ken and Roddy the same questions. You know, what do you think are the bright points of light that we're seeing in healthcare?
Well, I think we absolutely do have pockets of excellence. If you look at what Mercy in St. Louis is doing, what Intermountain Healthcare is doing, what Kaiser is doing, if you look at organizations that are pulling together their commercial teams and their supply chain teams so that the relationship that they have with hospitals is not just about selling products, but it's how can we reduce the overall cost to serve the healthcare provider. And that means you really need to look under the covers and understand you know, what it is. You know, I think so many different healthcare systems want different kind of customization and don't necessarily understand what's driving the cost. But when you can have that much deeper relationship, like you would see with a P&G and a Walmart, you're going to start to see that. And you see organizations like Johnson & Johnson or Boston Scientific or Cook Medical really leading the way in that particular area.
Ken, what about your perspective? Who do you think is doing it well right now?
Yeah, I see, you know, I talk to people about, you know, the old joke, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. I see some pockets. And again, I can't go into some details, but I see some really interesting things happening with medical device manufacturers who understand ideas like Lean and Six Sigma, collaborating with distributors who have high degree of excellence in logistics and bundling their knowledge along with their products in support of particular hospitals. And so there's some real nice kind of things going on around medical devices where a manufacturer helps make sure that the right supply chain and logistics systems are in place so that when the surgeon reaches that moment of truth, to coin the phrase, the right things are there holistically, not just is the implantable device right, but are all the other things in the kit. And I see that happening in pockets in medical device. I see it happening in some cases in the pharmaceutical business, especially around chronic conditions with large populations where there are strong user groups in play, so diabetes patients, et cetera, where again we get the manufacturers working with these patient groups, working with supplier groups and distributor groups to really begin addressing patient well-being. It's a little bit at a time. And what I see is that folks can now understand their common objective in those small situations.
Roddy, how about you? Who do you think is doing it well or points of light in the value network?
So I think this is where it makes sense to differentiate the industry a little. I mean, the problem in pharmaceutical is that many of the pharmaceutical companies are protected by patents, and therefore, you know, there is a demand on the patented product, and so therefore they tend to sort of push inventory levels, and it's all about inventory levels to secure supply. However, if you go to the other end of the spectrum into medical devices, I think the bright light is in a company like Baxter, who in France have RFID-enabled cabinets where every stent has an RFID tag, and when it's pulled out of the cabinet, there's a replenishment signal sent back to Baxter. So, you know, you have to ask yourself the question, why does the pharmaceutical industry not drive a replenishment signal, and why does the medical device industry drive a replenishment signal, and, you know, what is the difference? And I think therein lies the difference between segments, patent versus, you know, highly competitive medical device industry. And I think as the medical device industry and the pharmaceutical industry converge, I think we're going to see a higher drive towards making visible, and here's the point, exactly what is being used at the patient outcome level and translating that back into replenishment and inventory levels in the supply chain. And I think that's going to change the face of supply chain, because at the end of the day, let's take the equivalent to Walmart. If you're in out of stock in Walmart and you're a Procter & Gamble, you're in trouble, because there's such a highly sort of a valued relationship between Walmart and Procter & Gamble. So therefore, there's special attention paid towards in stock on a Walmart shelf if you're a Procter & Gamble product. When are we going to see the same in life sciences and medical devices?
Well, I think that's a great lead-in to the next segue. So if we look at value network, let's take a look at CPG and retail, and then let's come back to pharmaceutical and medical device and the hospital supply chain. So if we look at the decade and we look at the period of 2000 through 2003 for retail, and we look at the period of 2008 to 2011, and we look at the components of cash to cash. So cash to cash includes receivables, it includes inventory, and it includes days of payables. So you can see that retailers actually reduce the inventory levels on the days of inventory from the period of 2000 to 2003 versus 2008 and 2011. And at the bottom, we give you reference about which companies those are. So those are really grocery retailers. Walmart did even better than the typical grocery retailers. But if we look at CPG companies, which this peer group is Colgate-Palmolive, Kimberly-Clark, Reckitt Benckiser, Clorox, Procter & Gamble, and Unilever, we look and we say, oh, we've pushed inventory slightly back in the value chain. And what's happening is the CPG companies are squeezing their suppliers on payables. So, you know, we really haven't quite gotten to collaboration there. But when we look at the healthcare value chain, and we look at hospitals, so again, 2000 to 2003 versus 2008 to 2011, you can see the hospitals are decreasing those days of inventory, and surprisingly, they are actually coming down on days of payables. When we look at medical devices, look at the days of inventory. We're actually going up from 173 to 189, so we are pushing inventory back in the supply chain. And look at pharmaceuticals. Inventory levels in pharmaceuticals, Roddy, are 3 times the level of consumer packaged goods, or 3 times the level of what we see in chemical companies. So my question is this about collaboration? Is it about fundamental supply chain understanding? What do you think this is, Roddy?
So I think it's their definition of risk management. I mean, you know, let's not forget that if you're a pharmaceutical company, the majority of pharmaceutical products are, you know, life-enhancing or life-saving. And so at the end of the day, would you, as a pharmaceutical brand manufacturer, want to be associated with somebody dying because your product was out of stock in a hospital? So I think the way that, you know, when you take 15% COGS and very high margins up in the 80%, what is the way that a pharmaceutical brand manufacturer that has patent protection is going to protect themselves? It's going to be to hold hundreds of days worth of inventory. The question is that sustainable? And is that translatable back through medical devices and generics? And my answer is not.
Ken, your thoughts? Is this inherent in the healthcare value chain? In other words, we can't change this? Is this based upon the maturity?
Roddy Martin is a genius, and I need to start talking before him because he says it exactly right. Here's the issue, and this will sound funny to people who have not been in the industry. There's an extraordinarily strong ethical responsibility to keep patients well and alive on the part of the manufacturer. And so in the pharmaceutical business, and it's true in the medical device business, when a patient has an issue, whether it be they're out of product, their product's not of the right quality, anything like that, it affects the well-being of people, and it directly affects the manufacturer at a high level. Now, you couple that, as he said, with the high margin. And what pharmaceutical and medical device companies are trying to do, their basic business strategy is to succeed and survive based on providing innovative solutions to the market. So when they have one that works and it's making money at these high margins, they must protect the future of their business by assuring high level of sales, and they've got to protect the patient. So long story, at one point I made half the world's insulin, and if we didn't do our job right, people died quickly. And so we kept a year's worth of active ingredient around. So it's inherent in this category, the segment that says chronic care, life, no therapeutic substitution, high margin, innovative company. And so in one of your diagrams, Laura, you show the progress from cost-effective supply chain to resilient supply chain. And being a heretic, this is a way to create a resilient supply chain. I'm not sure that in the current context, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, as that business and as the nature of medicine changes, less and less patent-protected products, there probably are better ways to do this. But the supply chains that are set up, in many cases, I believe precisely support the business model and business strategy.
Okay, Karen, your thoughts?
I think, again, both Roddy and Ken are spot on, particularly around pharmaceuticals. I think in the medical device arena, we have a bit more opportunity. Our problem is that, getting back to Roddy's very first point about lack of visibility, lack of trust, we're not sharing data. So it's very hard to have good demand planning. So what you have on both the manufacturer side and on the hospital side with medical devices is kind of an inventory management just in case, which speaks to the points that both of the gentlemen made. So if you're a medical manufacturer, you don't want to run out of something and potentially lose a sale. If you are a nurse, you don't know exactly what you need, so you're literally sticking things up in ceiling tiles and in the corner of operating rooms and hiding things just in case you might need it. And with better data and better sharing and better trust, we can get a good understanding of demand. But when you have situations like, particularly in the implantable device supply chain, a manufacturer told me one day, he goes, I've got 2 years worth of product out of the field right now that's going to expire in a year and a half. That's just not good business. You've got inventory turns of maybe 1. And we have got to move with the new healthcare environment. Top-line growth is not going to be as possible for either the sell side or the buy side. So we really need to look at that operational efficiency, and inventory, I think, is a tremendous opportunity where we can identify savings and still make sure that we have those critical products on need so that we are caring for patients when and where we need to.
Great. Roddy, do you think people realize that inventories are growing and that the operating margins are declining so fast?
So, Laura, I think that's part of the problem, and I think that's where this whole space of control towers or, visibility across many information systems in an extended supply chain are so fundamental. And that is, I don't think they do. I don't think there is if we think functionally, we look at inventory, we look at costs, we look at patient outcomes. If we look at horizontal processes of the supply chain, we look at, availability and patient outcomes. And I don't think we've made that transition from thinking functionally to end-to-end process. And so I'm not sure that the dots are being connected. I think that when business leaders in pharmaceutical, medical devices, and generics start looking at what are our inventory levels, what are our on-shelf availability levels in a theater or at the patient? What are our distributor levels? What are our manufacturing levels? And when they start connecting those dots, I think we're going to start seeing the evolution of where consumer goods is because of their lower inventory and margins. We're going to start seeing the same level of supply chain proficiency, which, by the way, has taken its cue from consumer electronics.
Right, right. Do you think people are in connection with the fact that inventories are swelling? I totally get the ethics and the different dynamic of this industry, but do you see that people understand this?
If it's a question to me, I don't think they connect the dots. You know, there's five stages of maturity if you look at most companies and the way they've evolved supply chain. You react to problems, you build projects around problems, you build functional excellence, you make the flip to end-to-end horizontal capabilities, and then you work as a value chain. I think most pharmaceutical companies are still operating as projects, chasing, whether it's growth opportunities or cost opportunities. They have not made the flip to whether that makes sense from a horizontal end-to-end cost-to-serve capability, and therefore they haven't made that connection.
Karen, your thoughts?
I think again, you're absolutely right. If people are not looking at, and I'm going to speak more from the provider perspective right now, is connecting the dots and making sense and understanding, for example, the role that the supply chain, a true supply chain organization, can play in this, and working, because it is really the one function that crosses over different disciplines, different functions, goes outside the walls of the hospital. And as we're moving towards more accountable care, where you really need to understand what is delivering the best value from birth to death in the care of this patient, and understanding the different pieces, and as you had said early on, Laura, the trade-offs that need to be. So we need to understand what is our mutual objective, what is the data that we need to have, what kind of analytical skills that we need to have, what kind of, and it comes down to something, again, going back to retail and consumer packaged goods, are we speaking the same language when we're talking about the products that we're using? There is finally a move in healthcare towards standards. I'm actually at a conference today on unique device identification, which will really drive that. We need to have those fundamental, consistent, industry standard identifiers, but then we also have to make sure that we are capturing that data, sharing that data, using that consistently, not only across the supply chain, but say within the walls of a particular organization, across the entire product life cycle of a particular supply, a particular product. So there's a lot of dot connecting that needs to be done.
So common language, common goal. Ken, do you think people are surprised by this data?
Well, it depends who you're asking about. If you look at the C-suite, medical devices and pharma, the people that really are the leaders of those companies have backgrounds in health. They're physicians, they're scientists, or they're marketing people. And my experience is typically supply chain people are not C-level executives at these companies. So the C-level executives see the world as a choice. They have $1 to invest. Will they invest it? And $1 for salary of people, $1 for equipment. Will they invest it in research and development? Will they invest it in marketing and sales? Or will they invest it in supply chain? And based on where they've come from, those are easy choices for them. The people that I know and work with in medical device and pharmaceutical companies who are supply chain experts see the problem very clearly. And it's a really interesting dynamic, and I admire a lot of those people, because even though they are not in positions of authority and power, they are attempting for all their worth to influence these companies at the C-level to, as Roddy says, connect the dots. And it, unfortunately, when it's a kind of bottom-up movement, that takes time and moves slowly. You might expect over the course of time that the choices would become more balanced because the business models are going to evolve. And I fully expect that at some point in time, and I see it company by company, the light bulb comes on for the C-level executives, and then they are really waiting for supply chain management people to come forward with the right kind of capabilities and solutions. So I think there's hope. I just think that the folks who are in positions of power aren't quite there yet.
So Ken, Lora, can I just add a piece on to Ken, right? Because I think Ken touched on, in his last sentence, he said, people in the position of power. If you look at consumer electronics and then, you know, timeline-wise, consumer packaged goods, people like Lafley from P&G, what did they do to change the course of their organizations? They changed the mental model of what supply chain meant to the organization. In many organizations, if you go into supply chain, they'll tell you it means logistics. If you go into the advanced leaders, they will tell you, don't say supply chain, because if you call it a supply chain meeting, only supply chain people come to the meeting. It's actually an end-to-end value network. And I think therein lies the crux of the issue. When are the leaders of the organizations going to define and change the mental model of what supply chain means?
Okay, let's do the poll. Let's find out what the audience thinks. If you are currently working in the healthcare value chain, why don't you give us your feedback about why you think we haven't made more progress on inventory management? Number one, low priority. 2, lack of supply chain understanding, and let's use that as the executive team. Number 3, global growth and the needs of emerging economies. Let's see where we get there. You know, what I find is that most companies understand this intuitively, but when you put the numbers in front of them, people just haven't held themselves accountable to the financial balance sheet. And they go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, you know, we've been a decade of investing in processes and technologies, and we've gone backwards, not forwards, right? And so, Roddy, I hear you saying visibility, control tower. Karen, I hear you talking about standards. Ken, I hear you talking about patient-based outcomes. So what is the one thing that you think that people need to do? Karen, let's start with you.
Well, I think the economic realities. In healthcare, this is not like we have a set pool of money that we can be spending. And this is not just a United States issue. I'll be in the UK and having the same conversation next week. We're seeing it in other countries around the world. There's a set pool of money that a country, that a society can spend. So we have to figure out, how do we deliver care that drives those better outcomes and lowers that total cost of providing care? And it's only when we start to see all of those pieces together and then realize the role that the supply chain can play in that. And only when that understanding happens and when the supply chain professionals can help elevate, as well as when the C-level executives are also seeing it. There's a tremendous opportunity in terms of reducing the overall cost, getting the insights into what drives better care. That's where it's a lot of education and it's a lot of shared vision.
Ken, we've got the audience response back now. Then, 50% of the group say it's a lack of understanding of supply chain. 25% say it's low priority, and 25% say global growth. What one thing do you think people should do?
I'm going to tell you two. I'm going to cheat because lack of supply chain understanding. I find in these businesses an astonishing level of misunderstanding within people who call themselves supply chain professionals. Back to Roddy's point, too many supply chain professionals understand themselves to be logistics people, and that's horribly limiting. The second thing I'm going to tell you is, for those who do understand value network, folks need to find demonstration pieces. They need to find small opportunities and make them real. I think the potential is there. In fact, it's happening. Roddy referenced Baxter. I think the more of those demonstration pieces that we can put in place, be they large or small, the more that the opportunity becomes available. Because my sense is this is not a thing that anybody's going to put together this golly whiz-bang presentation and convince the world to change. It's going to be people who have vision from the middle of the organizations collaborating and making it happen, and then standing back and saying, see, that's what we can do.
Yeah, so start small and grow. Roddy, what one thing would you have people do?
Well, so Laura, I'm going to sort of take a comment that you made many times when we were at AMR Research, and that was, fact-based decision-making. And I think, you've written a great book, so's Gatorna written a great book, so's everybody else written a great book on supply chain. I think that you can put as many books in the industry about understanding supply chain as you want, but until you see the data that brings to light the facts as to how we operate an end-to-end supply chain, you are not going to get a change in behavior. So I think my answer to that is, until you bring to light the data that reflects the facts as to how inefficient we are in comparison to other sectors of the supply chain, we're not going to change any behaviors.
Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists, and I want to offer to the audience that we are mapping value chains, and we have reports available with detailed data on metrics that matter for hospitals, pharmaceuticals, and we're launching today one on medical device, and of course we have had operating margin and cash-to-cash in the market for a couple of months. Please use our data. Help us to help you to drive database discussions. And we also have in the market right now a survey on how we redefine relationships. It crosses the value chain, looks at hospitals, medical device companies, and also pharmaceutical companies, and looks at the state of supply chain. We keep every response confidential, and we will be reporting on this next month. We would love to have your help to fill out the survey. It is our spirit at Supply Chain Insights to provide information for the community to drive that higher level of discussion of supply chain. We're committed to doing that, and we appreciate your help. So Karen, anything you want to leave the audience with before we close here?
I think, kind of pulling it all together, what I'm hearing is, and what I hope people will understand more, is you can't do this alone. You can't. There was a cartoon I saw the other day, people in a rowboat, and there were people bailing water out of one end, and the people up on the other end of the boat were saying, boy, I'm so glad the hole is not in my end of the boat. We're all in the same boat. And we do need to redefine those relationships. We need to speak as common language. We need to identify that shared vision. And we need to look for opportunities where we can fix this problem overall, as opposed to looking at things in silos, which we so often tend to do.
Kim, any last thoughts for the audience?
For supply chain professionals, be very solid, be very good, be very determined, and seek partners, seek collaborators. Again, my approach is one of, I think we all see the same end in mind. The question is, how do any of us as individuals make that come into being? And for me, it's know what you're doing, don't give up, and collaborate, because Karen's right, you can't do this by yourself.
Roddy, anything that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think that, you know, at the end of the day, we have to change the mental model of this industry. And the mental model has to be patient outcome, and we have to see the data associated with patient outcomes. And when we all collectively see the patient outcome data, we're going to see where the weak points are, and we're going to go focus on those broken points. And until we change the mental model of the industry, nothing is going to change.
Well, great. I look forward to sharing the data from this report. I want to thank the panelists for joining me today. Our next webinar next month is on corporate social responsibility and the green supply chain. We're committed to keeping these webinars going. We want to have supply chain insights research to be able to help supply chain professionals everywhere push the baton forward on supply chain excellence. With that, Constance, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great, Laura. Thank you so much. It looks like we don't have any questions from the audience, but I wanted to mention save the date for our Supply Chain Insights Global Summit, which is September 10th and 12th, 2013 at the Phoenician, Scottsdale, Arizona. Registration is actually opening up tomorrow. So if you are not on our e-newsletter list, please go to supplychaininsights.com and just give us your name and email, and you'll be getting updates from us monthly, including information on this great event that we have coming up in September. With that, as Laura said, our next webinar is March 14th, Building Sustainable Supply Chains. I hope to see you then. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day.